So we'd like to say thank you and kind of welcome here for joining us here for the Government Finance Officers Association webinar on balancing the budget in bad times, evaluating and managing risk, and cutback budgeting. This is part of our Fiscal First Aid series. So as part of the Fiscal First Aid series, there are other resources available. So we definitely encourage you to kind of check out the Fiscal First Aid Resource Center on the GFOA website. So with that, we'll kind of go ahead and move ahead and talk about our speakers today. So definitely want to kind of go ahead and welcome in the panel. Today we're joined by Gordon Mann. Gordon is the director for PFM Consulting Group. We'd also like to welcome Nicole Pollock. She's the Chief of Staff for the City of Providence, Rhode Island. Also, we'd like to say welcome to Patrick Hopkins. Patrick is the Business Administrator for the City of Lancaster, Pennsylvania. So welcome, Patrick. We're also joined by Shane Kavanaugh. He's the Senior Manager for Research here at the GFOA. I also work here at the GFOA in the Research and Consulting Center as well. We did also want to let the folks on the call or on the webinar know today that we did complete a white paper that's sort of a companion material to the webinar today. So the link's there in the second slide 4. So definitely feel free to kind of go ahead and take a look at that as well. In addition to the white paper, there is also a one-pager kind of checklist. And that checklist sort of deals more specifically with sort of evaluating criteria for kind of different treatments that we'll talk about here today. So definitely encourage you to kind of take a look at some of those resources and kind of use those in addition to the webinar here today. So with that, we'll kind of go ahead and sort of move forward here. In terms of kind of the plan for today's session, we'll get into sort of reviewing sort of fiscal first aid and talk a little bit about that. Some of the different approaches to some of those near-term treatments. We'll also, from there, kind of move forward and summarize some of the cautionary treatments, as well as some of the extreme tactics, and then obviously get into the discussion, panel discussion, where we'll sort of talk about when to use these and how to fill in some of those gaps. So with that, we will kind of turn it over to Shane and kind of get into the session. So welcome all, and we'll kind of turn it over to Shane.
All right. Thank you very much for that introduction, Mark. I do appreciate it. Mark, can you see my slide here with the 12 steps through the recovery process?
Yep.
All right. Very good. All right. Well, as Mark mentioned, that this is really kind of the second part in a two-part series. The first part took place last week. If you missed that, we have the YouTube video up on the GFOA website, so you can check that out. Last week, we focused in on step 5 in our 12 steps through the recovery process. And if you see step 5 is near the bottom, near-term treatments. Last week, we talked about the lower risk near-term treatments. So those are sort of the go-to strategies you might think about when you're faced with the need to reduce expenditures or enhance revenues in the next 12 to 18 months, like I think we all pretty much are right now. However, sometimes these go-to low-risk treatments are not going to be sufficient. And in fact, I'd probably wager to say for most governments, they're not going to be sufficient, which is why we have today's webinar, where we're going to get into some of the riskier treatments that you're going to probably have to consider as we go forward in the next 12 to 18 months. These are some of the primary treatments we discussed last time. These are all very good, kind of, we'll say, low-hanging fruit that I think all governments should consider, and I'd encourage you to take a look at that white paper if you haven't already seen it, and check out some of these things to see if there are opportunities that perhaps you have not been able to take advantage of up to this point. So with that kind of frame, we're going to move on to today's topic and maybe on our first poll question, which is, has your organization implemented any of the primary treatments described so far? So as meaning kind of if you had a chance to look at that white paper, or if you're just saying, well, I haven't, here's the list. If you've had a chance to implement any of the things on the slide or any of the other primary treatments from the GFOA research, if you're familiar with it. So we'll give everybody a minute to think about that. And Ben, you can go ahead and close the poll question when we have a critical mass. So while Ben is doing that, let's move on to cautionary near-term tactics. And so at this point, I'd like to welcome Gordon onto the webinar. Gordon was a part of our project to help put these questions or these tactics together. And Gordon, I believe you had a few things you wanted to say about some of these cautionary near-term tactics.
Yeah, thank you very much, Shane and Mark, and thanks to those of you who are out there participating today. My name is Gordon Mann. I'm a director at Public Financial Management, consulting firm. We work with cities and towns and counties and states and help them try and solve their budget questions and operational questions in any environment, including this one. And this is about as challenging as it gets because of the uncertainty and because of the depth of the financial hit. So GFOA put together, again, as Shane mentioned, a really good, thorough first paper on where to start. If you're looking at your budget or looking at your cash flow or looking at your financial projections and seeing a big hole, where do you start and how do you start to try and close that gap? And the first paper that Shane mentioned, those preliminary steps, are really things that you probably are, and if not, should be doing anyway. They're low-hanging fruit. Their reliance on transparency and accountability, making managers manage. And if you're going to take any further steps, and you're probably going to have to start with that list, because you're going to have to build credibility in the eyes of the people that you're going to make sacrifices so that they know that you've done everything you can before taking these riskier steps. You can see the first set of them here. And most of them are pretty intuitive, right? You don't need an explanation for what a wage freeze is or for what outsourcing is. And as you read through that the list, you're probably all wincing a little bit because none of these tactics are easy. There's downsides and risks to all of them, and we'll get into some of the real-world application of them here in a little bit with the panel discussion. But encourage you to look at the white paper and that sort of helps you think through some of those pitfalls. Some of these are things you might think about outside of the current crisis. So, the question of do we outsource, do we insource, do we divest certain functions? That's something that you're probably going to wrestle with even in a non-COVID-19. But as anyone who's gone through that process of trying to decide whether to bring things in-house or outsourcing will tell you it's hard. It's sensitive, and the financial impact is not always straightforward. I mean, there's likely to be someone in your organization that is absolutely certain that you can save money by outsourcing, or absolutely certain that you can save money by bringing functions in-house. And often the question of whether you can save money depends on what the market is, what the providers are. You'll also notice that this list here is focused largely on personnel. And, as you're very aware, most of your budget for most cities and counties and provinces and local governments are mostly personnel costs. It's where you spend most of your money. Local government is a people business. We're not in the business of building aircraft carriers or doing those types of large capital projects for the most part. And what we tell folks when they think about personnel costs is it's a complicated, difficult, personal world with two very simple variables. How many employees do you have, and how much do you pay each one? And that's really what these two variables are what the personnel costs are playing with here. Rest of the cautionary terms, again, won't read them to you. The one thing that I would highlight here, restructure debt, a bit of a sophistication in terms of an important one. Refinancing debt is when you go out and get a lower interest rate and pay less overall. Restructuring debt is when you pay less now and then pay more later, or you stretch out the debt on the back end. So refinancing debt would be a preliminary or a primary tactic. It's something that you should do, and you should take advantage of the opportunities to lower your debt costs anyway. Restructuring debt is not as straightforward. The extreme cautionary tactics, if those were hard, these are harder. So in a lot of cases, these are more extreme or more severe versions of things you've already seen. And you probably haven't seen too much on this list that hasn't already crossed your mind, that isn't already something you're thinking about, or in some cases have already done. For some governments, the tax anticipation note, that may be a way of life for you already. You may be a government that for cash flow reasons or for whatever reasons issues debt early in the year to get you through until your cash receipts or your tax receipts start to arrive, and then pays it off. The challenge with doing that in this particular environment, as you know, is the uncertainty. You know, when I left my office 2 months ago, I thought I was going to be gone for 2 weeks, and now I'm not sure when I'll get back. And there's some thought that, you know, in this part of the country, remote working may continue for the full year, or for much of it. So trying to project when you're going to have the cash flow to borrow off these, to pay off these short-term borrowings becomes increasingly tricky. The other thing I would say here before we get into the panel discussion is you may be tempted on at least a couple of these to kind of jump them forward in the process, right? So early retirement incentive program. This is something governments will use even outside of a crisis, doing the calculation in their head, something like this. Well, I could freeze everybody's wages, but that would be really hard. Or I could get some people to retire and leave early and get my savings that way. And the challenge with these programs is, one, it's a mathematical challenge. A wage freeze, the savings compound over time, right? So my salary is frozen today, so it's lower every year going forward than it would have been if I did an increase. That's just the math of it, while the early retirement incentive program works the opposite. The position's open for now, and unless I'm going to eliminate it entirely, I have to fill it, and that person's going to gradually see wage increases till they get back to the level I was at already. So the encouragement here is to work through the tactics in the order that they come. Now, with that, we'll go to our second poll question. Kind of an interesting response on the first one, whether people had used the primary tactics. Now we go a level up in difficulty here, whether you've used the tactics we would deem cautionary or extreme caution. I'll give you a second to answer that. And then I've got some good news. The good news is, for starters, we realize everything that was on those two lists is unpleasant for the most part. It's unpopular. It's largely against the instincts of what you as good financial managers want to do, right? So you spend your whole time gearing your organization up to evaluate needs and assess them and plan out when you need to replace them from a capital improvement cycle, and then you put it all on hold, right? Then you can't do those things, or you can't do those things right now. There aren't too many organizations who went into 2020 saying, the one thing we really hope to achieve strategically this year is furloughs, right? We're in a situation where long-term planning and those types of strategic things become very difficult. And we recognize it's even more difficult because, you know, depending on where you are, but really everywhere, just such a vast amount of uncertainty. Uncertainty how quickly the economy will reopen, uncertainty whether it will close again, uncertainty what type of recession we have, the impact on tax rates. There's far more we don't know than what we do know, and yet you and your colleagues and the elected officials and the boards that you serve still have to make decisions, right? We've graduated past that phase of initial shock with the answer to what do we do about this is I don't know, right? Now it has to be more complicated than that. It has to be I don't know or I'm not sure, but, and that's what we wanted to do here. We wanted to give you some ways to think through the painful options, and in addition to giving you the ways to think through those in this kind of criteria that we've laid out, and we'll work through these one by one, we wanted to give you two people who are doing this in real time, right? So assume if you're on here, you're working for or working with the government or governments actively, and you got to figure this out on the fly. And there's no playbook, and there's no precedent. And even if you want to go back to the Great Recession and think about what that did, this is very, very different. So I'm going to welcome in our two panelists here. Patrick Hopkins is the city manager and business administrator for the city of Lancaster, Pennsylvania, in the southeastern part of the state. And Lancaster is in the situation where its annual budget is adopted on a calendar year. So Patrick is in a spot where this is theoretically the time of year when Pennsylvania governments are flush with cash, and Patrick should be Scrooge McDuck diving in and out of his money and then trying to make it hold up for the rest of the year. Patrick, welcome and thanks for joining us.
Thanks very much, Gordon.
And Nicole's in a different situation. She is the chief of staff for Mayor Elorza in Providence, Rhode Island. And she's in the unenviable position of not only trying to think through what COVID-19 means right now, but what it means for next year. So Providence is like a lot of governments. They're in the process of adopting a budget for next year. So her answer to the question, what do we do now, really can't be, I don't know. It has to be much more thoughtful than that. Welcome, Nicole.
Thank you so much.
So let's jump right in here and get to the first criteria that we had on that last slide, where we tell folks or how we guide folks in terms of thinking about when they say I have a hole to close, how do I close it? I have a deficit. Consultants love to answer questions with questions, and our answer is usually, well, how big is the hole? How fast is it getting there, and how does it change? And of course, the answer to all of those questions right now is I'm not sure, I don't know, and I don't know. But Patrick and Nicole, you have to have better answers than that. So we'll start with you, Patrick. Give us a sense for how the city of Lancaster, Pennsylvania is estimating what COVID-19 is doing to you guys financially.
Sure. Thanks very much, Gordon. And as Gordon said, we're on a calendar year basis. Just for scope size, our budget is about, general fund budget is about $62.5 million. So we really began the sort of sizing the whole question with identifying those sources of revenues that we have that are directly impacted by the economy. We had a good sense of that. I've been with the city of Lancaster since 2006, so had a good sense of what those revenue lines are in our case anyway, from going back and looking at impact in the Great Recession, 2008 through 2010. And for better or for worse, I can identify a mere 5 line items in our general fund budget that have that are impacted by economic activity. And some of these are Pennsylvania specific, others are not. Earned income taxes and local service taxes are wage taxes in our case. Real estate transfer taxes, obviously home sales are taking a significant dip with what's going on right now. Building permits, because we've essentially been shut down in our county in Pennsylvania anyway. And then the fifth one is parking violations, which seems like a strange one, but in our case, we suspended street cleaning for a period of time, and we're also not having downtown parking meter enforcement. Parking violations for us is a $1.7 million line item, so it's a little under 3% of our budget, so not enormous, but it is certainly a thing that we can't ignore. So we started there, and then looked at, those revenue sources are about 20% of our general fund revenue. So in most years, I complain about the fact that we are over-reliant on real estate taxes, which represent about 50% of our revenue. But this year, I'm actually quite happy that we have 50% of our revenue coming from real estate taxes, because this year compared to last year, we're basically exactly where we were in collections, and I expect that we'll end up relatively close to even in our real estate tax collections. So, we identify those revenue sources, and then we look at, I've been trying to look at what the worst case scenario is, or what I hope is the worst case scenario for the economic impact on those 5 sources of revenues. In our case, I looked at scenarios ranging from 5% to 30%, and I'm usually an extreme optimist, but I'm kind of pessimistic this year, so I'm using that 30% number as we're going to see a 30% drop in each of those sources of revenue. And when I do that, I look at a hole that's about $4.7 million that's created in our budget. So that sort of gives me the scope of an anticipated hole only in 2020, and really so far, that's what I've been looking at is just 2020, and later on we'll talk about the potential, some of the longer term impacts. But one of the things that Gordon said is, right now would be a time when we would be flush with cash. And actually, at the end of April, our general fund cash flow, our general fund cash position was the highest it's been in 10 years. So if all that I did is, I didn't know what was going on in the outside world and only looked at our April financials, I would actually think things are fine. So the other piece is sort of identifying what are the lag times in some of these revenue sources, and trying to figure out when the bottom is actually going to drop out of this, because I know my May financial report is not going to look nearly as rosy as my April one. And I'll toss it over to Nicole at this point, who unfortunately for her has been in the midst of actually creating a budget so far.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. So just to give some context again, we're a city of 180,000 people. Our city budget is $506 million. We also support budgeting for the school, which in total brings us to about $775 million budget. And we have about 1,500 people in our workforce and 35 different departments. So I won't go over the different, we're going through that exact same process, so I won't belabor it, but we have a slightly different scenario with state revenues. We are obviously in the midst of doing revenue estimating conferences with the state to better understand the state impact, which is very different than the city impact. And we depend pretty heavily on state aid in our budget. So we have in our budget process assumed full state aid. However, we know we are not going to get that full state aid. We assume it because obviously we want to balance our budget and show the state that we can't do without that revenue. But at this point, the major cuts we have put into our proposed budget is cuts we know are based upon revenue that will not be generated, such as the hotel tax, meal and beverage tax. We are anticipating pretty severe cuts in those. We are anticipating a reduction in the number of on-time taxpayers we have, so just our collection rate. It's also been suppressed back to recession levels during the 2009 recession. And we are still assuming full value of other state revenue sources to the city. So we almost have a budget that, I don't want to call it, it's not a fake budget, but it's a budget that makes very optimistic assumptions from a strategic standpoint. However, we know we'll probably take an additional $15 to $20 million in additional cuts in the next 6 weeks. So we have a contingency plan for all of those cuts on how we would deal with those cuts in sequence.
Nicole, I'm going to follow up and put you on a spot a little bit here because, Patrick and folks like me who are working in a non-budget environment, we have some ability to kind of work on the numbers behind the scene, and we're not asked probably every day or every other day for what our numbers are. But when you're putting a budget together, you have to share those with other people, starting with council and then with the public at large. So how are you and the mayor communicating your thought process and the way you're approaching this to others so that they feel comfortable and confident, not just in the number that's on the page, but in the process that supports it?
Right. I think the how is consistent, honest, where appropriate, and thorough. So obviously our public communications, we are providing an overview of the budget as it's presented. That already looks severely cut to the public because it is not a bigger budget than last year's budget. So natural growth is not observed. So it already looks like a fairly lean budget. Most of the regular in-depth communication we are having is with our partners in government and city council, in addition to the unions, which is a lot of the savings that will need to be realized in the budget once we get the proper state aid numbers into the budget will need to be realized in agreement with the union. So I have, in my job, I do the collective bargaining with all of our bargaining units. So I have fairly close relationships, regular communication with our union leadership, and it is truly a daily communication. And my approach with that is if you have union leaders who you can be confidential with, you can trust. I'm lucky to have that. I have very honest, blunt conversations with them about what the impacts might be, and I know their concerns. And I try to incorporate those as we go and we look at the different remedies or treatments that we will need to use. Council, it's the same. We do regular webinars. We use Zoom often to kind of go through the numbers, what the treatments need to look like, and really talk through what are truly value propositions in a time of, reductions. You have to really choose what your values are collectively and try to fund based upon those values.
Patrick, I know you're fortunate in that your mayor. I would think of her as a numbers person. Mayor Sirachi is the council finance chair for a while, and we've done presentations for her personally, and so I know she thinks in terms of numbers and is comfortable with that. But I'm also guessing some of your council members aren't. So how do you convey the financial impact to people who just don't really think in terms of debits and credits and revenues and expenditures? How do you communicate with those folks?
Well, fortunately, since I've been in this position since 2006, and with a whole host of different council members over that period of time, have consistently presented 5-year budget projections. It's not a requirement in Pennsylvania, but we do it along with our budget introduction each year. So our council members are, at least once a year updated with those 5-year projections. So they have some sense of where we are now where we were in a pre-COVID world. What we did most recently, actually just last week or maybe the week prior, we did an information session with our members of council in a private setting. Pennsylvania Sunshine Law allows those for if we are simply doing an information sharing with our council members. And one of the difficulties that we have in terms of having our council members understand the financial issues is that we have a strong mayor form of government with a part-time elected city council. So these are folks who have regular day jobs and have their minds in all sorts of other things, especially at this time. But we wanted to have that information session with them really to sort of, the primary part of that was looking at how are we sizing the whole? What are the impacts that we see? And as Nicole said, trying to be transparent and honest with our council members to make sure they understand that we're having to make some preliminary cost-cutting measures to deal with the world that we know, or at least we think we know. And we also are trying to get them to understand that there is an awful lot of information we don't have right now, and we are having to, as we keep saying, build the plane as we fly it, and just trying to maintain those regular communications with them. And I totally agree with Nicole in terms of the labor union piece. I'm also the one who does our labor negotiations and have good relationships with our 3 bargaining units, and trying to be transparent with them to the extent possible about what we're seeing right now and where we're going to be going.
I'm going to give you guys in the audience a chance to participate here. Give you our third poll question. Which statement best describes your current status for estimating the pandemic's financial impact? You have an estimate you've shared publicly, or maybe estimates if you're doing kind of scenario analysis. Maybe you have an estimate that you're keeping internally. Maybe you're working on it, and maybe you're just saying, I have to wait and see. Or any combination of those. I'll let you mull that over and respond.
All right. And I'm going to jump in here, Gordon, just for a minute to let folks know we are going to make a transcript of the panel discussion, so just folks are aware that that will be later on.
I'm going to choose fancier words now since I know that. Moving over to the financial impact, we know a lot of the decisions that folks have to make are not purely financial. But you're joining from GFOA, so you're we assume a finance leader, and you may not have to have the answer to everything, but one thing you probably are going to have to answer as you think through these gap closing strategies is how much does it save, right? You have these painful decisions that you have to make. You have a hole. You have some sense of what that hole is, with the understanding that that's an evolving answer. Now you've got this menu of ugly options. How much does it close the gap? And I'll start with you, Patrick, because you've had to wrestle with this from an area where I think a lot of our audience probably has in terms of furloughs, right, and reduction in force and those sorts of issues. It's common. It makes financial sense from the perspective of that's where government spends money. If you have a bunch of employees who are at home and can't work remotely, it makes some common sense, but it's also really difficult. And even the math isn't straightforward because of the calculation of unemployment benefits and when can employees access unemployment, even if they're eligible, and all that sort of stuff. So talk us through a little bit how you've approached that in Lancaster.
Sure. So and we have implemented furloughs in the city, and before we got there, those furloughs were effective April 27th. So we're really only a couple of 3 weeks into the furloughs. We began curtailed operations on March 15th, I believe it was, and sort of over a period of a week, as things got more serious very quickly in our area of Pennsylvania. Went on full curtailed operations a week later. When we began the curtailed operations, we also created some new pay codes so we could track the amount that we were spending on our weekly and biweekly payroll for those individuals who were not working, and whether we had them on a rolling schedule where they were working some hours and not working others, or if they were completely off. We focused in on our weekly payroll, which is strictly our AFSCME, so our non-uniformed bargaining unit. And the reason for that is that we were able to have telecommuting capabilities for the vast majority of our non-bargaining staff, who in our case are only about 15% of our workforce, and is primarily supervisors, managers, and department directors. So we focused in on that AFSCME piece. And over a period of a couple of weeks with that new pay code, we're able to track the cost of paying people not to work. And initially, when it seemed like this, may be a short-term thing, our commitment was to try to have the least financial impact and operational impact on our employees. And we, over time, it was clear that consistently we were spending across all of our funds, general funds and our enterprise funds, between $95,000 and $100,000 a week for those AFSCME employees who we were paying not to work. That was a number that was impossible to ignore, given the $100,000 a week. So then, at the same time, we began digging into the weeds of the CARES Act unemployment comp calculation. It took about 3 weeks to get clear guidance from the Department of Labor about how the additional $600 amount was going to be applied and who would be eligible for that. And so we did a bunch of work between those two sets of data, the how much are we paying for people not to work and how does the unemployment comp work, to figure out who we could apply the furloughs to, and because of the additional $600, we could determine that each one of those individuals would be have no lost revenue or no lost income, and in many cases actually have more take-home pay, quote unquote, on unemployment comp because of the expanded CARES Act amount. So our numbers were that we furloughed 39 full-time employees and another 31 part-time employees, and that represents roughly 10% of our total workforce. And because of that, the preliminary work that we did, and we'll get into this later when we talk about labor negotiations, but we were able to work closely with our AFSCME bargaining unit to get them to understand that we weren't just making a rash decision and pulling the trigger on furloughs immediately, that we were, we did some analysis and we were thoughtful about both our service impact, but also the impact on the individual employees. The sort of postscript to all of that is we provided a ton of information to our employees to help them navigate the Pennsylvania unemployment comp system. And as Gordon, I'm sure, has heard from other cities in Pennsylvania that he works with, and this is probably the case across many states, but the Pennsylvania unemployment comp system is, to use a technical term, a hot mess right now. And we are having to really help employees navigate the system because there's just such a backlog because of the incredible pressure on the system. So there's more to come and more work for us to do in that arena.
Nicole, you had mentioned on the last criteria the concept of that this is about balancing value, what you value and what you prioritize. Can you tell us a little bit more about how that's taken shape in your budget process?
Sure. And, that's partially a little theoretical, but if you just look at, revenue generation on that side, value proposition are really around what revenue generation does in terms of who it impacts. So if you're seeking revenue generation from a small business sector that is likely to collapse or be severely impacted over the next year, both that's not probably the right value choice if you value small business, but also is probably a very risky choice based upon the fact that that may not be a stable sector to double down and expect additional revenue from. So that's kind of what I mean on the revenue side. Obviously, we have some more stable revenues that are not forcing us to make those choices. But for instance, we actually chose to provide a benefit. We have a tangible tax here, an inventory tax. We've actually chosen to take a hit in our budget to reduce inventory tax for small businesses over this next year. Even though we technically kind of can't afford it, it felt like the right value proposition in this moment to make sure that we're doing what we can to support small business. In terms of cutting expenses, obviously, value proposition, are you focusing that on your employees? What types of employees, contracts, other liabilities? We have obviously put long-term financial stability at the forefront of our priorities. The city, under other leadership, underfunded the pension 18 out of 20 of the previous years. Before we came into office, our pension is funded at around 26% right now, which is really low. I'm sure everyone knows that on this call, but sometimes I have to tell our council members that's really bad. And so making 100% of our ARC payment is a value proposition or a priority we have, even though we're only required to make 95%. So that would be like the absolute last change we would make. So that's what I mean by value propositions, is aligning if you're a pro-small business city, if you have made a commitment to long-term financial stability or long-term financial investments, you're probably going to need to weigh those in the choices and cuts that you do make.
Excellent. Thank you, Nicole. So as we move on to the next one, we've kind of appropriately focused a lot on finance here, but realize that local governments are not just purely financial institutions. That if you ask the average citizen on the street, what's the most important city government service, they might say police, they might say fire, they might say paving the streets or schools or whatever it is. They probably don't say tax collection. They probably don't say accounting and treasury, even though those things are obviously critical to everything else. But start with you, Patrick, because you alluded to this in your last answer. You've got to cut costs. you know you have a limited stream of revenues, you found a creative way to try and thread the needle and minimize the impact on the community in your public works department. And I was hoping you could tell the folks about that.
Yeah. So the number that I mentioned in the last slide, the $100,000 a week cost, the furloughs really only dealt with a portion of that $100,000 cost, and the reason for that is, and I'll give all the credit to our Public Works Director, Steve Campbell, who just actually started with the city in January. He brought forward an idea about redeploying some of our public works staff. Initially, we were talking about only using those redeployed staff on capital projects where we would have otherwise contracted out a bunch of work, trench paving and some things like that. So the concept here was that we already had some budgeted expenses where we would otherwise have contracted out for construction or other services. And normally we would do that because we didn't have the in-house staff to be able to do that work. And so in this case, we identified 56 public works employees who would otherwise have been subject to furlough, either a reduction in hours or a complete furlough. And we could put them to work on some of these things where we would have otherwise paid a vendor, a contractor. And by doing that, we're able to get the work done at a lower cost, because in our furlough program, we're continuing to pay benefits to employees and are simply not paying them their wages. So we're able to charge our wage expenses for these redeployed employees to those capital projects, or in some cases into like contract services or professional services lines in our enterprise funds, and reduce our overall wage expense and still get some of this work done. To a certain extent, we were using the Rahm Emanuel law, never let a good crisis go to waste, and we knew that there were some things that, and even some longer term planning work that we could do, where we could put some of our sort of administrative staff to work doing some data gathering and things like that that will, in the long term, support some capital project planning that we need to do. So those redeployments were extraordinarily helpful in reducing the impact of furloughs, which also helped us, in terms of negotiating how we were going to do the furloughs with AFSCME, because we were telling them up front that we were basically cutting the furlough impact in half by coming up with the redeployment concept.
Thanks, Patrick. I know we talk about service impact and in a non-pandemic environment, something that we always counsel our clients, even though we know it can be very painful, is to give the community a chance to speak before you make a cut. You may know that you have to close a park or close a fire station or whatever it is, but give the community a chance to speak. They may not tell you something you don't know. What they say may not counter the financial realities, but it will be better for everyone if they have a chance to state their case and they feel heard before you make a decision. And that's really hard to do when you're only allowed to be in a room. There's a limit to how much you can do on Zoom or WebEx. So Nicole, I know you have a very diverse population there in Providence. How are you guys managing to stay in communication with residents or neighborhood groups when you can't physically be in the same place?
That's a great question. I'll talk through some of the approaches we use. First and foremost, we have actually increased the amount of money we are spending on translation and communications. If you look at just good crisis communications protocols, obviously or crisis management, obviously you spend a lot of time on task forces and teaming related to your response internally. And then the next biggest and equally important piece is communications and engagement. We have set up several advisory groups that are part of the COVID response, but are involved in our budgeting process more broadly. So we have a Latino leaders group, a women leaders group, an African American leaders group, and a finance leaders group. We also are doing Twitter town halls. We do virtual community meetings, daily updates, and Mayor Lorza is multilingual, so he also delivers most information in multiple languages, and it goes on Latino radio 3 to 4 times a week, in addition to normal radio 3 to 4 times a week, or English-speaking radio, to really talk through the value propositions we're being faced with, and also talk through our response to this epidemic. So those are just some examples. We also spend a lot of time visualizing the budget. So we do a lot of infographics and a lot of visualizations for non-math experts to kind of convey proportionality more than just numbers and spreadsheets. And that also, in combination with good verbal communication, helps clarify financial concepts with a population that may not be expert in financial management.
So I wanted to move on to the fourth criteria, which is a fun one. It's politics, right? It's one of the partners in our firm. If you start to complain about having to get something passed, he reminds you that that's not a problem, that's democracy, which maybe makes you chuckle and then mutter under your breath. But political realities are part of this, and what people were willing to do 2 months ago is not necessarily what all people are willing to do right now or 2 months into the future. So, again, Nicole, you're on the front lines of this, because whatever happens with your budget, I don't know how many council members you have, but more than half of them, I'm sure, have to pass your budget. So how do you take political feasibility into account and making sure you have enough yeses to get a budget passed?
Well, one, make sure that your budget is override proof. So we always make sure, even if we don't have a majority, we always make sure we have enough people who understand, the budget choices we're making and agree with them on our side, that if anything goes south with the council, we can always, not that we'd like to veto and then go back to the drawing table, but it does compel people to stay at the table and work together if needed. However, in terms of political feasibility, really this is related to upfront communication and regular communication. A lot of our council members, of which we have 15 in a small city, so it's a lot, are not finance experts. So looking at a budget on paper doesn't meaningfully relate to the neighborhood programs and services that they deem important. So it is my job and my staff's job to make sure that is well understood, and that concept of, if this is really important to your neighborhood, here's the line in which that is funded. So if that's being cut here, that means the thing that you depend on day to day in your neighborhood is no longer there, or is not there, it's there in a diminished capacity. So we spend a lot of time before the budget is even introduced really trying to work through with the majority and what we call the minority, so the non-leadership level council members, to make sure that that's well understood collectively so that there's broad information. We also meet weekly with the council financial advisors to come to some agreement around what cuts look like if and when they need to occur. So we do a lot of that work. And then, of course, publicly, you want to make sure you've got your external stakeholders ready and communicating with your council, with your other leaders, so that they're helping reinforce the message around what's most important and what the value propositions are in the budget. So are you choosing between providing stipends for young people in the summer versus keeping trash collection or street sweeping at the same level? Not to say that that's the two you're choosing between, but if it is, people are really familiar with what those trade-offs are. So we spend a lot of time with external stakeholders building up their capacity to communicate with our partners in government, as well as spending a lot of time up front with those who are both in power and those who are not in power but are on council, to really make sure that everyone has a collective understanding of what we're proposing.
Patrick, I'm wondering about the political challenges you face, Lancaster is a blue city, but Lancaster County is a red county. So, and, you know, they're starting to see some of those tensions play out about what people are willing to do now versus what they were willing to do a few weeks ago. How are you working through the political realities of what you have to deal with?
Well, you described it well in terms of our situation politically here, and really, you know, the sort of starting point of all this is that for years we have been transparent about the financial challenges that the city faces in normal times, in non-COVID times. So we had already really built up a well of understanding and the fact that our community and our political leaders, regardless of party, understand what the city's fiscal constraints are, and also understand that when we present numbers, they're real numbers. We're not sort of overly pessimistic, overly optimistic. So that's trust and transparency is a real sort of kind of mandated starting point for all of this. We have created, talked about the information session that we have with our city council members, so just to keep them up to date. But we've also, the mayor and I have done Zoom sessions with our 3 county commissioners, with our member of Congress who represents all of Lancaster County, which has a population of about 530,000 versus the city, which is about 60,000. And the mayor's also talked with Senator Casey and talked with staff in Senator Toomey's office. So we've had a sort of consistent message that we have put out, most of it, honestly, just through a basic slide deck of what the pre-COVID world looked like, what the impact that we're seeing with COVID now, or our anticipated impact. And just, you know, building discussions around that, because there is an awful lot of decision-making yet to be done that will impact whether or not we see funding from the federal or state government that will either underwrite some of our unanticipated costs or replace some of our lost revenues. And we're in an unusual situation where Lancaster County was one of only 8 governments below the state level that received CARES Act funding directly. Lancaster County received $95 million of funding, and there, no surprise, there is some political back and forth about how those funds will be spent within Lancaster County. And I've got some different positions about what are eligible expenses to be reimbursed through those dollars than others might. So, for the most part, the sort of political feasibility or the political sort of back and forth has been relatively low. But we have, as Gordon mentioned, recently run into some struggle about when we can reopen and in Pennsylvania parlance move from level red to level yellow, which is opening up businesses a little bit more. So, and all of that's going to have an impact ultimately on the revenues that we end up getting, because the sooner businesses are able to open up, that will be revenue producing, but there's the clear health impacts that everybody is also concerned about.
Thanks very much. We have about 6 minutes left, and both for our panelists who have those important jobs that I mentioned earlier, and for all of you who have been on the phone. And we started with a bunch of you, and none of you have left. So that's great. We want to be respectful of your time. We've talked about some of these things. Of course, we've tried to keep this very practical and to come back to some of the challenges. There may be things you want to do where you have to work with your unions, and Patrick and Nicole have talked about that. There may be some federal or some state issues, and Patrick and Nicole have referenced that. There's still only 24 hours in the day, and you're still only one human being. So the little graphic notwithside, you still only have 2 arms, so there's practical limitations for that. So I rather than work through the bullets that are on the slide here, which we've already covered in a bunch of places, I'm going to kind of give Patrick and Nicole, one last question. You've got 430-something people who are on the line, and they are waiting to hear from you. You've got one piece of advice, one trick, one thing you've done that's worked, one thing that you'll use in the non-COVID-19 era, whatever it is. The floor is yours, Patrick. What do you want these 431 people to know?
Wow, that's a question I wasn't anticipating.
Off script.
I think, well, and I'll say this up front, and I answered one of the Q&As in here. City of Lancaster, we're fortunate. We have all sorts of financial difficulties. But because we have been doing the work in trying to educate our community about the city's financial struggles, when we present information in now the COVID world, as I mentioned earlier, there is a level of trust there that when we're talking about financial information and the sort of the values that go into our budget, there are no surprises. So I guess the thing really is maintain that transparency now and going forward. Be clear about the values that go into the decision making that you have. Normally, that's about like, can we expand services in this area or another to address a community need? And now we're sort of on the flip side of that, having to identify those services that we may need to cut back. So one other point there I wanted to make, and I'm going to hand it back over to Nicole, and I will jump back to that point as soon as it jumps into my head.
Great. Yeah, that's a big charge. I guess a few things I would say: create a place for ideas. And what I mean is place in your leadership style. One of the things I have learned is to not belabor and create too much time for open brainstorming, but to make sure that there's a space for it in these really hard times, because sometimes the person who's not in a place of power is the person with the idea that you need. So make sure that your organization is set up and you have set up processes to get those ideas and hear that information from your team. That goes into the second, which is lead, don't micromanage. This is not a time where most of us have the capacity to micromanage. I have a 2-year-old and am working from home, and I'm chief of staff and have a lot of other family obligations that I'm sure all of you do. So lead, don't micromanage. Use a good task management software. I can't emphasize this enough. We use Asana. Some people use Slack. I think Asana is much better, but have a place where you can keep your project plans organized. Try to spend time on organization to make sure that you can actually implement and track the ideas you're working on. And going back to the first point, be clear about your values to your directors, to the public, as you make these choices. If you communicate those values and tell people that you are sticking to those values, even if there are hard decisions to be made, they're much more likely to stick with you if you lead with the values.
Patrick, I made you go first, so I'll let you go last. Did that last point come back to you?
Yeah, it did. And this is in response to one of the questions on the Q&A about whether or not we have a rainy day fund. So in City of Lancaster's case, we have a general fund reserve that's about 25% of our annual expenditures. So we have, in my view, a little bit of flexibility that we do not have to make extraordinarily rash decisions immediately. And that has given us the flexibility to, at least in my mind, to do some additional analysis, wait and see a little bit, because, again, fortunately, I'm not in Nicole's position of having to produce a budget at the same time all this is going on. So we can be a little bit patient and do the true analysis that so that we're not making some of those extreme, doing some of those extreme considerations that were earlier on in the presentation with no information. The last thing I would want to do is do a significant layoff of employees or do a significant service cut now in anticipation of the sky falling, only to find out 2 months from now that we're going to get a reimbursement of $3 million from the federal or the state government. That is going to close a big part of our gap. So if you do have that flexibility, while it feels like the sky is falling, take a little patience, step back, as Nicole said, lead, and talk to your community about the things that are the most important to them, and make decisions based on the best information that you have available to you.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Mark and Shane to wrap this up.
Okay, so we'd just like to thank everybody for joining us, and just to reiterate, there are resources available. The white paper is available, as well as some additional resources. Obviously, the video for the prior session and sort of the additional materials for that. So with that, we thank you for joining us, and have a great afternoon.
Thanks, everybody.